So just to frame the discussion, as you all may have seen yesterday, Ron joined us at during the second session after the opening, which was on basically the humanitarian landscape and the changes that we are seeing. And Ron gave us a good kind of overview of what are the changes that are coming as part of the humanitarian reset and the emergency resident coordinators. Sorry, emergency relief
Image relief
coordinator.
coordinator.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
It's the end of the day. The 10-point agenda. So Ron gave us a good update on the different pieces of that, but the piece that we really wanted to focus on today, of course, Ron may see appropriate to bring some other elements as well, but the focus of the discussion today, we wanted to be on the element of cluster simplification, which is part of the reset of the humanitarian architecture. I will share some slides in a minute, but Ron will give us a bit of an update on what we see already, or we anticipate being the impacts of the simplification and the recommendations on the child protection sector. So Ron would talk to us for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will have hopefully 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. So we'll have Ron for the whole 30 minutes that we have for this session. With that, I'll hand over to you, Ron, and I'll share your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Hani. So yes, something we're in the complete middle of it. Cluster simplification. It's our second iteration of simplification. As you probably, some of you may recall, we had a similar exercise on protection cluster simplification based on the recommendations from the ISC, the independent review of the implementation of the ISC protection policy, where UNHCR was tasked to come up with a paper on protection cluster simplification. That was a long process and ended up with about 35 recommendations to be followed up both at the global as well as at the country level. Now, on top of that, because of the humanitarian reset, and maybe the next slide, please. With this slide, I also shared with you yesterday. Some of you who were there may have seen that, may recall that. There is also a simplification. Sorry, the arrow should have been at 9, not at 10. Simplify clusters is an area of work that has been handed to the chairs of the operational and advocacy group of the ISC, and the co-chairs of that are UNICEF and Save the Children, and the two co-chairs have been tasked to come up with a paper with recommendations on how clusters could be simplified. Next slide, please. So we went through a process that started at the end of April, and this is sort of the timeline of that cluster simplification process, which started off with a meeting between the OPAC co-chairs, coordinators of the global clusters, and the cluster lead representatives of the cluster lead agencies. And that process sort of came to a not complete conclusion, but a semi-conclusion, let me put it that way, with a draft, a final draft that was shared with the ISC deputies, which met yesterday to, among other things, discuss this report by the OPEC co-chairs. They will submit that these days, either today, tomorrow, to the ERC, And then there will be a ISC principals meeting on the 17th of June, which will make the final decision. So in this process, you will see there were between 25 April and 12 May, there was a work that was done by the CLAs, the cluster lead agencies, and the leads of the global cluster coordinators that led to a set of recommendations that were presented in early May to the OPEC co-chairs. They provided feedback, and there was a revision of those 4 papers, and I'll come back to those 4 later, by the different groups, and they submitted a final paper to the OPEC co-chairs, who then consolidated that the feedback and gave their own take on it, and presented back a recommendations paper to the cluster lead agencies and the global cluster coordinators. In the meantime, they also started to consult with others beyond this group, and including donors, INGO. So IGVA, for example, had a meeting with the OPEC co-chairs, and they've also consulted with some people at the country level. And then that led to the final draft that was presented yesterday at the deputies meeting. Next slide, please. So as I said, the first meeting, the group of representatives of the cluster lead agencies and the global cluster coordinators and some of their deputies or co-coordinators were divided in 4 work streams that worked on 4 different areas. One was around people-centered approaches and localization. And the interesting part there, and that's, I think they did a great job by really bringing in the voices of local and national actors. So they did a survey where local and national actors were asked about their opinions on the humanitarian reset. So they spoke out in that, and that report was just recently, I think since yesterday, was published under the title "Local and National Actors Speak Out on the Future of the Humanitarian System." And we'll share the link with you in the chat. But that's a good way of how within that process, and it was the only work stream that actually did that, was trying to gather the voices of our local and national partners, which fits well with the theme of this annual meeting of the Alliance, of course. So that's what was the first group looked at. The second group looked at an operational refocus. Particularly, initially, the idea was that they would look at the process as well, because those of you who are involved in coordination and humanitarian program cycles know how heavy that process has become, and how that is keeping those of you working on it busy from July onwards to almost the end of the year, with assessments, with numbers, data on people in need, targets, budgets, etc., culminating in a humanitarian needs and response report. So that part was actually taken out, and it's now taken on by the HPC steering committee. So this one looked more at different operational coordination modules, so focused quite a bit on area-based coordination and how that could work best in conjunction with the cluster system. So coming up with recommendations around the fact that not looking at it really look at it as a complementary structure and not a duplicating structure. Then the third group looked at cluster simplification, and I will work on tell a bit more about that, which is what I mentioned before, with the OPEC co-chairs that were looking at cluster simplification. But this cluster simplification was really looking at, okay, we have 11 clusters. Do we need all of them? We have 4 AORs in a protection cluster. Do we need all of them? and really trying to see where we could streamline the cluster system in terms of the clusters themselves. And then finally, there was a group on crisis and transition context, which looked at what are the options for transitions and deactivation, and it was basically trying to also see what needed to be put in place to accelerate deactivation and transitions. Now, what I'll focus on is particularly the part that looked at the simplification from the perspective of child protection. As you may remember, and I referred to that earlier, the IASC also had an independent review of the implementation of its protection policy. We'd already said that the protection cluster is too complex, too complicated. The architecture needs to be simplified. And that already triggered quite a bit of discussions around, why do we have all these AORs? Are they needed? Should they just disappear? Etc. Now, within that discussions that followed, led by UNHCR on protection cluster simplification, we managed to all come together as AORs and safeguard and secure our space and existence as AORs. Then you may have seen the paper that was drafted by and that was requested by the ERC to Jan Egeland, the head of NRC, and Joyce Musuya, who is the deputy in OCHA, to come up with recommendations on humanitarian response. They said in their part when they looked at cluster coordination, they said that the protection cluster needs to be lightened and may need to be simplified by reducing the number of AORs. They didn't say we should get rid of the AORs altogether, but we should at least reduce the number of AORs. So that was one recommendation, and that already led to some ideas transpiring at the country level to just say, well, the AORs can be removed altogether. On the 5th of March, when the humanitarian research started to gain momentum and the different strands that I mentioned in the previous slide, the UNHCR's High Commissioner wrote a letter to the ERC where he basically recommended that the AOR should be dissolved and we should move towards a work stream in a protection cluster at global level led by UNHCR. And that at country level, UNHCR could live with the fact that they wouldn't be leading the protection cluster in all countries. And any other agency better placed could be chosen to lead the protection cluster at a country level. But at global level, they would remain as the lead of the protection cluster in a different constellation. Now, that letter triggered, of course, a lot of reactions, but it also was then proposed by, at least that idea was proposed within the cluster simplification work stream under bullet point 3 as one way of addressing and coming up with solutions to simplify the cluster. And indeed, it found its way into the first report by the OPEC co-chairs, which basically mentioned that the protection cluster and the AORs and work streams, even though they didn't exist yet, work streams should be consolidated as the recommendations from the OPEC co-chairs. We as the AOR, we realized that that wasn't going to that it wasn't going to work to fight that. We also the discussions we had with the UNICEF OPEC co-chair that fighting the idea that the AOR would dissolve or consolidate with the protection cluster wouldn't work. So we started to see what would be best for us to move forward. Anyway, I'll come back to that later. But just to say that with the documents of the OPEC co-chairs after further consultations with stakeholders presented yesterday at the deputies meeting, they have a recommendation that looks at the protection cluster and clusters in general at the country level and global level. Now, at the country level, they say that humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian country teams should decide if and which clusters to activate and which can be merged based on the prevalence of needs, crisis complexity, and capacity of national and local responders, in consultation with relevant authorities and in line with humanitarian principles. Given that there will be fewer countries with activated clusters, so far only 3, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Colombia have been suggested. Double hatting at subnational level with its safeguards could be considered in specific circumstances. At country level, where appropriate, co-leadership with local entities should be considered. So in this part, it could be foreseen that other agencies, UNFPA, maybe UNICEF, but even INGOs could lead or co-lead a protection cluster. So it doesn't have to be UNHCR. So here, that option is provided, and it's something that's not new. Humanitarian coordinators in principle could have done that already, and it was also a recommendation coming out of the independent review of the IDP response. But the big change is the bigger change, and that's the merging of clusters is happening at the global level, which will have some impact also at the country level. Next slide, please. So relevant to us as child protection is the fact that the 4 areas of responsibility will disappear, will collapse, or consolidate with the protection cluster. So from 11 clusters and 4 areas of responsibility, there will be 8 clusters left: education, food security, health, land and shelter cluster, which will include shelter and camp management, camp coordination, and housing, land and property, which is currently in the protection cluster, the nutrition cluster, the protection cluster, a service cluster with merges emergency telecoms and logistics, and a wash cluster. On the protection cluster, HLP will most likely move to the land and shelter cluster, and mine action may remain within the protection cluster. So we may remain with 3 AORs in the protection, or 3 areas, not AORs, because AORs will disappear, will remain in the protection cluster. Now the agencies, and this further on the recommendation, the agencies involved in existing clusters and AORs agree on the future arrangements of the cluster lead agency, ensuring diverse and equitable representation aligned with expertise, mandates, and capacity, to be endorsed by the emergency relief coordinator or the YASC principals in their meeting on June 17th. Specific to the AORs, the AOR leads are to consider seconding capacity to the protection cluster lead agency, so UNHCR, to help transition from separate AORs to one integrated protection cluster. So basically, one, AORs will disappear. Two, we can still look at arrangements that need to be put in place to safeguard some of our area space as child protection. And three, we should consider as a lead agency as UNICEF to second capacity to the protection cluster lead agency. So what we've done, and already before this recommendation, this particular new recommendation or elaborated recommendation came out yesterday, we drafted a safeguards document for governance and functioning of the new integrated protection cluster. We did that together with our GBV AORs and between UNICEF and UNFPA. And there's a discussion going on between the agencies, UNFPA, UNICEF, UNHCR, to come to an agreement on those safeguards. They talk about the space for resource mobilization, the continued visibility, the role in decision making, etc. The idea is that there will be an agreement between the agencies before the 17th of June, because that's when the ISC principals meet. And most likely UNICEF's executive director could make a statement there to say that we've agreed on this. And it's really about safeguarding a dedicated space for child protection so we don't completely disappear within a protection cluster. Then, as I said, there was the final proposal that was discussed yesterday. We're waiting for the outcome of that meeting and what's been decided. I don't know yet. We'll hear that shortly once the minutes are out. And then, as I mentioned, there will be a discussion and a decision by the ISC principals on the 17th of June. At the same time, there are discussions happening internally, both within UNICEF and within their partners who are providing co-coordinators on the staffing for coordinators, co-coordinators, and information management officers at country and global level. We already know that in UNICEF these discussions are happening and that we will be losing dedicated coordinators, dedicated information management officers, and co-coordinators as well. We face the same issues at the global level, where our staff will be very limited going forward, which also, of course, has consequences on how much support we'll be able to provide to our country colleagues who are going through major transitions to make this new constellation of a protection cluster work. Let me stop here, and Hani, I don't know if you want to move on to some questions from posing to participants, or we move into participants asking questions to me.
Yes, I don't see anything in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, sorry, if you have any questions, please feel free to come in. Nicole is asking about the type of safeguards that are being discussed to ensure that we don't lose centrality of child protection in the protection cluster. Can you share more on that, Ron?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. What we are looking at in those safeguards is one is to ensure that we secure the visibility of CP and GBV issues, risks, and responses in our interaction with national and international entities, with donors, and in interagency forums, as well as the joint needs assessments, making sure that if the HNRP continues to exist, that we still have dedicated space for child protection, and also in advocacy and analysis. We also want to make sure that, as the idea is also to have one strategic advisory group, both at global and country level, that there's an equal representation of the different parts of protection. So we don't have a dominating protection cluster that just have protection actors and then a few CP and GBV partners included in it, but there is an equal representation. Also knowing that we have both in GBV and child protection many partners, and many in local and national actors. And we want to make sure that they continue to have that space within a strategic advisory group and contribute to the strategy setting of the protection cluster. Also, we want to be treated equally in terms of importance when it comes to resource mobilization and allocation, and have an opportunity to fundraise bilaterally as CP and GBV, and access funds, because we know we have donors that are particularly interested in child protection and want to know that their funding actually goes to CP and GBV partners. We also in it try to ensure that we retain the provider of last resort responsibilities for child protection and GBV, and that we preserve predictability and accountability for CP and GBV services in line with the cluster functions. We also want to ensure that we maintain specialized CP and GBV capacity and expertise, and that it's not taken over by generalist protection officers. And ensure that we find arrangements that secure the engagement and participation of local and national actors. So that also we look at, as we know now, in some countries we have co-coordinating local and national actors, both government as well as national NGOs and women-led organizations, for example, for our GBV colleagues. So how do we ensure that that space still remains at the country level? And also that we remain to keep that space where we can still work with line ministries and on system strengthening, so that we are also ready for any transitions that may happen, given that there are also discussions going on around accelerated transitions. And then finally, that we look at how we ensure there is some way of finding ways how we come up with joint decision making within the protection cluster, both at the global and the country level. Our GBV colleagues are still looking into and still pushing in a way for trying to get a co-leadership of the protection cluster at the global level. They have their full support of their executive director to move that. We don't know where that currently stands. We know that UNHCR definitely wants to hold on to its leadership of the protection cluster, also given that they may have to give up their leadership or co-leadership of the camp coordination, camp management, and the shelter cluster, and they see themselves really as a protection agency. So well, that's still a discussion that's ongoing, but that's what we aim to push for. So far, the discussions have been very positive, and UNHCR hasn't sort of pushed back strongly on those requests. So that looks positive, and it looks like we can come to an agreement on at least the safeguards. I think the co-leadership one will be a bit more challenging, but we'll see how that will work out. For us, it would be good if for UNICEF, there's no chance we will opt for co-leadership, because there's already quite a lot of comments on why UNICEF is still, despite the cluster simplification proposals, UNICEF is still leading or co-leading three clusters. So it's not going to fly for us, but if UNFPA gets the co-leadership, it would be good for us, because it would at least also give us an ally to support our area of work, because they're often in a similar position as we are in child protection.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ron, for this and for all the work that you have done so far to make to basically advocate on behalf of child protection. I have put a Menti poll in the chat. I know it's very late, but in the last 2 minutes that we have, it would be great if you're able to give us some of your thoughts on two questions that we have. One is on the type of gaps that you think this will leave in the field, um, or at the country level. And then we'll all go to the second question, which is about how to fill those gaps in your view. So this will give Ron and us some food for thought um, going forward. So please take the last minute of today to help us reflect on this. And then we promise we'll let you go and rest and get ready for tomorrow, which is the last day of the annual meeting. Great. So I'll see. I'm not sure what EAFGA stands
It's
for.
CAFAG in French.
French.
Oh, okay. Okay. Um, okay. Risk of children being lost and deprioritized, a humanitarian response, less clarity and coordination, requiring shifting ways of thinking and working. Lack of leadership with very specific child protection issues, for example, CAFAG. Great. Since we are at time, I'll also share the second question, but this remains open for all of you guys um, to keep reflecting on. On that note, I want to thank Ron specifically for his time and all the efforts. And this is a discussion that is not going to end here. This is just the beginning. And hopefully, with all the work that you're doing around on safeguards, we will be able to maintain some meaningful space for child protection coordination in humanitarian operations going forward. Thank you very much, and we
Thank you,
look
Hani,
forward
and
to
also
seeing.
thank you for the Alliance support and having this space yesterday and also today to talk about the important changes that are going to happen and how we can come together also as a child protection community to safeguard our space in the humanitarian response and to safeguard the voice of the communities that we and the children that we work with, so that we can continue to keep up a quality response to child protection issues in a humanitarian context.
Great. Thank you so much, and we'll see hopefully all of you tomorrow.